Hi, this is Dustin Hausner. I am the Jewish Outreach and Program Director at the Wayne YMCA. All our Jewish programs are funded through the Jewish Federation of Northern New Jersey. Today we have a wonderful guest. We have Elliott Rabin, who will be joining us today. Elliott, it's wonderful to have you here today.
I am really delighted to be here with you, Dustin. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, our pleasure. So before we begin, I'm going to read a little bit of Elliott's amazing bio, and then we'll get into some of the great things he does. And then he has a magnificent book that I finished reading the other day that I would love to talk about in case anyone's interested, which I'm sure you will be at the end of this interview. But let's start off by reading and getting to know a little bit of Elliott. So Elliott works to promote thought leadership in the field of Jewish day schools, in particular as the editor of Fitzma's magazine. Yehidin at Rav Zakski's Director of Project and Content Development. He initiated programs such as Project Rope, Roots of Philanthropy Education, Mut Bit Din, JCAT, the Hebrew Poetry Contest, the Judica Art Contest. Previously, he was the Director of Education at Makor. And I do want to, before I continue on, my audience is very familiar that I butcher names all the time. Please do not take it personally. I do not want any hate mail, please. Previously, he was the Director of Education at Makor, a program of the 92nd Street Y. He has taught classes in Jewish studies, Hebrew language and literature, and world literature in universities, JCCs, and synagogues. Elliott holds a PhD in comparative literature with a specialty in Hebrew from Indiana University. He's the author of Understanding the Hebrew Bible, a Reader's Guide, and is completing his second book on biblical heroes, which, of course, we have here today. So did I get through everything? I always feel like I missed something when I read a bio.
You did beautifully. Let me just add that I currently work for an organization called Prisma. You mentioned a previous organization I worked for, RavSoc, which was one of 5 agencies working with Jewish day schools that merged about 4 years ago into one unified entity called Prisma. And so that's where I work now.
Fantastic. Can you tell us a little bit about the work you currently do, and then also if you can talk a little bit about your connection and interest in Jewish literature? That's a very interesting field, to say the least.
Oh, absolutely. So I work with a team that supports Jewish day schools throughout the United States, Canada, and schools worldwide. And, you know, ordinary public schools have their boards of education and a network of local schools that they can plug into and get support from. But Jewish schools don't have that. So they have us, Prisma, which helps school leaders to connect with each other and get ideas that way, to plug into recognized experts and consultants on a wide variety of issues. And my job is a Director of Thought Leadership, which means I help bring leading ideas and best practices, bring inspiration to school leaders, and to highlight the great work that's going on in our schools. So it's a real privilege to work with hundreds, if not thousands, of talented educators and school leaders all over the place, and connect them through our magazine, through our website, our webinars, our programs, and many other things we do.
Very cool. So what brought you to specifically the literature, specifically obviously the Hebrew Jewish literature? What got you on the path of wanting to do this?
That's a great question. Life I find takes you here and there. And I remember years ago, Joseph Campbell, I don't know if you're familiar with him, he wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. Mm-hmm. And he had a wonderful series on PBS years ago, and his mantra was follow your bliss. And I suppose I've internalized that in my life path. I always had a love of literature, used to read a lot starting in high school, and then studied it in college, went on to graduate school, spent some time in Israel and got to know Hebrew literature.
Mhm.
And then I went to Indiana for comparative literature. It's one of the oldest programs, not the oldest program in the country.
Hmm.
And one of the things that appealed to me about their program was they had a special track in comparative literature and biblical studies.
Interesting.
So I developed my knowledge, my background, and skills in that area there. And then I wanted to move back to New York. It wasn't so easy to get professorial jobs, so I've worked in nonprofits for a while, but I love keeping a finger in the world of scholarship and to find ways of bridging scholarly academic thinking with the interests of a general audience. And that's really my aim in my writing.
Interesting. So it sounds like there was a nice origin of a passion for this type of work that obviously connects to both your books, of just the stories, the characters that just over time kind of elevated to this point where you decided to find a professional avenue to take it sounds like.
Exactly. You know, I think people bring their whole selves to the reading of the Bible. And there are so many ways you can approach it, and there are so many ways in which it can enrich your life. But you know, my belief is that the Bible is, you know, it's a book of law. It's the foundation of our religion, but it's also a tremendous resource of literature as well, and it's one of the two primary sources for what could be called Western literature. The other, of course, being the Greek foundations of Homer and his followers. So I think people, you know, when you read the Bible in school, or you read it in synagogue rather, or you read it by yourself, or you read it with the Jewish tradition, you don't necessarily have the literary lens or literary sophistication to know how to unpack them as works of literature. So that's really been my goal. My first book aimed to give people, understanding the Hebrew Bible, aimed to give people the tools that they could use for different kinds of genres in the Bible to get more out of them: stories, poems, what's known as wisdom literature, prophecy. How did those kinds of writings tick? And then my new book looks at a subject that is found in all literatures, the idea of the hero, and tries to explain the Bible's particularly fascinating and problematic ways that it depicts its characters.
So before we jump into the biblical hero book, I am curious, in your first book that you said was, you know, an understanding the Hebrew Bible, a reader's guide. Could you give an example of kind of one of the tools that you bring up or talk about to help read it? Because kind of as you mentioned, I think for many people, there are those where it's very easy, others it's incredibly difficult, and then there's so many different directions and interpretations you can go. So I would be very curious if you can give an example of a type of tool that someone could use.
Thanks for asking. I actually wrote it quite a long time ago, and it's not on the top of my head. But I would, you know, I go through, you know, so one thing that I think is interesting about the book is we talk about biblical history, but there are really two kinds of history of the Bible that I untangle for the reader. One is the history as it's presented in the Bible. How does the Bible write about history? How does it view history through a theological lens? And so I spend a chapter on that. And then there's the history of the Bible, right? How are these stories, how were they written? How were they compiled? How did they come together? And there's an enormous body of scholarship, which is very, in general, it's often hard to find. It's constantly being updated and tweaked. And I think I give the readers a helpful kind of overview of how to think about those bigger questions of the writing of the Bible, the book itself, and its history. So that's just one of many examples.
No, it's very much appreciated. And again, it sounds like a very interesting book. But like I said, I do want to talk about your newer book, which, again, I went through the biblical hero portraits in nobility and ability. So for me, it was kind of interesting because originally when you first look at it, you think, okay, he's going to give us basically, this is the hero, this is what they did, this is the next person, this is what they did. And it's kind of it's the story we've heard of, why these people are heroes and why we should help them. But what's interesting and what I like is before you get into the book, before the intro and then even the first chapter, you try very hard to explain the outline of what is the concept of a hero. So I'm curious, and you talked a little bit about it because obviously you grew up interested in this, but why was it important for you to try and explain the concept of heroism before getting into the biblical characters? Like, why did you feel that was important for the reader?
Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, there are a lot of books that just take one character, say, and explain and go in great depth into that character. Lots of books about Moses, some about Jacob, and lots of other characters. And that's, that could be a valuable approach for sure. But I felt that there were meta questions about the Bible's portrayal of a hero that needed to be addressed before we could get into the particular characters. And so that's why the interesting kind of ungrammatical aspect of the title, the biblical hero, portraits singular, and then portraits plural in nobility and fallibility. There are other books that go through many different biblical characters and try to give a little portrait of each one and how they're heroic. But often when they do so, they have to draw upon midrash, upon rabbinic legends, because the biblical portrayal of these characters themselves is not so clearly heroic. The Bible, in fact, one interesting thing is there's no biblical word for hero.
Interesting.
There's a word in Hebrew, gibor, which today can mean a hero, but in the Bible it simply means strong or mighty, right? And it's interesting that word is not used for some of the greatest heroes in the Bible, such as Moses and Abraham. That word never appears. So there really isn't necessarily a concept within the Bible of the hero. And so I felt it's interesting before we get into particular cases to think about why it is how the Bible portrays heroes and why biblical characters are portrayed more complexly, with more flaws often than heroic characters from other traditions.
No, I think that's very important. And you mentioned obviously Campbell, who you mentioned in the book, of course, as well, of kind of the old classical idea of the story of the individual has the journey, they go against some sort of great entity or some great force, they come back and bring so you go through that classic. But what you also do that is interesting is you talk about the American idea of hero. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about that, because I think it's interesting that you went that route of what we see as a contextualization of a hero and why that's relevant to the biblical characters.
Right, because the biblical hero is somewhere in between the classical and the American model of a hero. So I thought it'd be interesting to kind of give two different perspectives on what a hero is. So the classical hero, as I say, the word hero itself, had one of its meanings in ancient Greek, as I understand it, is demigod,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And the word seems to be related to the god Hera, who's the protector. So the that is obviously a very problematic idea for a monotheistic faith, right? The Bible, even though different biblical scholars, they they give nuances to how whether the Bible's really monotheistic verse, or whether at least in the older parts of the Bible, the Bible says there is one supreme God, but there are other gods. You just should avoid them or not pray to them. But be that as it may, the Bible essentially is a work of a kind of severe monotheism, which emphasizes that people cannot become gods. That's really one of the main underlying assumptions of biblical stories, right? Which is a major, major difference from other ancient cultures. And so if a person cannot become a god or a part god, they can't become a hero, mm-hmm. right? In the ancient model,
right?
Or it's much, much harder for them to be so. And a lot of times, we see God kind of reproving, punishing, chastising the major heroic characters in the Bible. You can think of Moses striking the rock and God saying, "Enough, you're not going into the land, you betrayed me." We can think of certainly King David when he has adultery with Bathsheba, right? Mm-hmm. And then arranges for Bathsheba's husband Uriah to be killed, right? And then God's prophet Nathan comes and says, you are the one who gravely sinned, and you're going to suffer, and your children are going to suffer. Mm-hmm. So there's anytime a character gets too powerful and consequently, threatens to become part God, the Bible makes very clear that they are in no way divine, and they have to be put in their place. So that's the kind of classic model. And then of course in Homer and other ancient texts, mm-hmm. the line between the gods and humanity is highly porous.
Right. Well, it is.
So people can become gods come down and can pretend to be people, and people can threaten gods, and the gods become very upset. Very different from the biblical ethos. Then the American, you brought up the American idea of the hero. Well, there are different aspects of this, but the American idea originally is a hero is an outsider to society. We think of Thoreau at Walden, right? He depicts himself essentially as a kind of hero because society is essentially corrupt, yeah. And you need to get out of society to purify yourself, and in that way you can exert influence on others and approach something like heroic stature. We think of the Western heroes,
It's very funny you say that, because I remember when I was reading that part, I kept thinking of Clint Eastwood and The Man with No Name, the whole idea of the stranger comes into town and all that. But it's true. It's a huge part of the idea of the person wandering from goodness knows where and then, riding off into the sunset, whatever that means. That is a very big American idea.
Very big, exactly. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is the ordinary person as a hero. This is what we see in Walt Whitman. The person in the crowd, and he elaborates and enumerates every single person that he meets in a crowd, and they're all heroes. And he talks about sailors who sink to the bottom of the sea, and they're the heroes, right? The unnamed, the anonymous, the basically democracy itself, the democratic person, meaning everybody. We're all heroes, right? And some writers even take it a step further and say it's really the person at the bottom, whether they're poor, in some cases oppressed. We can think of some African American novels in that regard, or others, the poor farm workers, Steinbeck, whatever. I mean, there are a zillion of them. And we have, America also shares with the Bible a deep discomfort with the idea of the hero as being someone above other people, so far above other people. Really, that's the classic mold. But I think insofar as, America has that kind of democratic ideal of a hero, that's drawn from the Bible. Of course, the Bible has had tremendous influence on American culture as well. So the Bible is somewhere in between. It's an ancient text. Its heroes are often depicted as the leaders, the kings, but there are a lot of others as well who are heroes who are not in those positions. An American hero sometimes goes, I would say, lower than the biblical hero will go. Biblical hero isn't necessarily an outsider, although some of the prophets are similar in that regard.
So one other thing I'll mention that I thought was very interesting and kind of leading up to when you talk about the characters, then we'll get into the characters or the heroes themselves, is you mentioned in one part of it when trying to explain the differences, which I thought was very interesting, the absence of moral standards. A classical hero is measured only by the glory of victory. Biblical heroes, by contrast, are expected to conform their behavior to God's will as expressed through divine law. I thought this was very fascinating because, to me, yes, I think when it comes to classical, obviously the victory, however they're able to do it as long as they're victorious, that's what matters. And then even just the modern heroes, the morality is so based on the time of the writing itself that's how it's interpreted. Whereas the biblical ones, you're saying, are really judged specifically by God Hashem's standards in what are the moral practices. So I just thought that was a very interesting way of looking at it. So you make a lot of thoughts in it, but that one particularly stood out for me.
Mm-hmm. So if you think I think one of the interesting things that I think I discuss in the book is how some characters start out as almost non-Jewish heroes. Mm-hmm. They start out seeming more like Greek or foreign heroes mm-hmm. than in the mold of Abraham and Moses, right? Who are really their morality, their relationships with God are really, and their the burdens of leadership are really profoundly expressed in their stories. Whereas, when the first time we meet, Samson, he's killing a lion with his bare hands, and he massacres thousands at a time. He tears off the hinges, the gates of a city off of its hinges and drags it halfway across the country. I mean, he's really a Hercules, right? But interestingly, he is a Hercules who's kind of plunked down in the middle of the Bible, where the other stories have this moral universe, and he can't avoid that. And he potentially, he's punished, he suffers, and then after the suffering, it's as if he becomes potentially a different kind of hero. So he's a kind of Greek hero who is put through the ringer of biblical culture and comes out somewhat different. Jacob also, he shares tremendous similarities with one of the most popular types of heroes in the world, the trickster, right? And trickster characters are a lot of fun, but one of the things that they are really known for is not really caring that much about morality.
Right, and the repercussions.
and so that's Jacob in a nutshell. He takes advantage of his father's blindness to steal the birthright from his older brother. He takes advantage of his brother's hunger to steal the birthright. He steals a blessing from his father, and it doesn't seem to bother him, right? And this is so different from his grandfather, who we just spent, many chapters with. So, and again, because he's in the Bible, he doesn't wind up his trickster character, his trickster genetics, you can call it, it doesn't get the last say, and he's made to suffer and reflect and go through tremendous hardship and watch his sons also become tricksters and fight with each other and cause a lot of tsuris, as we would say, before finally there's a happier resolution.
So I don't want to go through every character in the book, because I think people need to actually read the book. But just to read off, you mentioned Moses, Samson, Esther, Abraham, Jacob, David, and God. So you mentioned earlier that Moses is obviously an extremely popular character in Jewish in the Bible. He's, I would say, really the character that Jews, no matter how religious or secular you are, know of Moses. And there's this very particular image of Moses that people see as this strong, heroic, the Jewish hero. But what's interesting is, well, number one, some of the humanity and flaws that I'll let you kind of talk a little bit about. But I'm curious, in your opinion, why, out of all the characters in the Bible, why Moses is so elevated constantly? Because he's a very interesting character, but I find it interesting that he is so continuously kind of seen as the peak hero compared to all the others.
Right. The term that has become associated with the Torah, one of the terms is Torat Moshe, the Torah of Moses. He was the main recipient of the law, the main teacher of the law. He led the people at the pivotal moment in our history. And so he is indelibly associated with the origins of ourselves as a nation and the origins of our national relationship with God, as opposed to just our individual and familial relationship with God that we have in Genesis. So for those reasons alone, Moses is the ultimate hero or leader or originator of our people. But none of those things really get at who Moses is and how he's portrayed in the Torah, as you say. And there are, Moses, I call him, the paradigm, the archetype of a biblical hero, both for his strengths, for his incredible relationship to God, and also for the fact that his weaknesses are really so strikingly presented over and over again throughout his story. And the nobility and fallibility, the strengths and weaknesses cannot be separated out. Of course, some people would like to. We'd like to have our heroes be pristine and pure and mounted in gold. on statues, and that's not a biblical hero.
No.
So I think that's really, to me, what's fascinating about him is that he sets the mold by being so complicated and flawed. And one of my favorite scenes that really encapsulates for me this kind of inextricability of those two sides of people's characters is when he is perched on a mountain, perched on a hilltop, overlooking a battle that the people of Israel are forced to engage with. The people of Amalek come and attack them, and Joshua, who is Moses' servant, his much younger, healthier, more vigorous sidekick, he leads the children of Israel in battle. And then we don't see anything that goes on down there. Instead, the camera is up there in the hilltop with Moses. What is Moses doing? He's an old man. He has his hands held up to God, right? And on one side you have Aaron, the other side you have Hur, and they're holding up his hands because he's weak and old and he can't hold up his hands. And when he holds up his hands, God strengthens the Jewish people, and Joshua is able to rout the people of Amalek, the army. When he's too tired and he droops, then Joshua loses. So it's fascinating. Moses is, on the one hand, he is the person responsible for Israel's victory. And on the other hand, he does nothing. At the same time, he's old and weak. He can't fight in the battle. He can't even hold up his hands, right? And then on the other hand, everything boils down to him.
Right.
If he weren't there, the people would have been wiped out, right? So it's that wonderful complexity, nuance, and that strange, complicated relationship between God and the people that really encapsulates something iconic, I would say, about the Bible's portrayal of human characters and the possibility of heroism. Right? No one else could have been there holding up their hands, but Moses is alone could have done nothing.
One of my favorite little snippets about Moses, and I think it goes into certain characters that we talk about in the Bible, is I remember when I first read that he had like a stutter. And in my mind, that was such a human thing. Now, whether it was because of his fear at the time, whether it's because he actually had some sort of disability when it came to speaking with people, where obviously many people have written about it, like the different theories behind it. But it's those human characteristics that I think people, that doesn't show up really in our cinematic version of Moses, and the role of Aaron as kind of the speaker for Moses, who was the speaker for God. Again, it's usually shown as kind of Moses as the person, the iconic. So I think it's interesting how those are such important characteristics to the character, and yet we don't see it as often, I would say, unless you read the material. So I think that's very fascinating.
I think that's really important, because when you read portrayals of heroes in a lot of other more ancient stories about them, the heroes are really, the knight in shining armor. It's King Arthur, and he's so strong he pulls the sword out of the stone, and no one else can do it, as an example. But the Bible often, not always, but often emphasizes characters' weakness, whether they're physical weakness, moral, personal weaknesses of various kinds. Samson not being able to withstand Delilah's seductions, as an example.
Yeah.
But and like you were absolutely right, we see it right from the beginning with Moses and his stutter. He is slow of speech, heavy of speech, it says in the Hebrew, heavy of tongue. And for that reason, and who knows what other personal reasons, he is extremely reluctant to accept the mantle of leadership and authority that God places upon him. And we have, really one of the longest sections in the Bible, one of the longest dialogues, certainly between God and a person. And Moses repeatedly, over and over, and says, don't make me do this. Don't make me leader. Give it to someone else. I am not worthy. Okay, but God says, okay, I'll help you. You are worthy, but okay, I'll help you. I'll do this. I'll give you Aaron. I'll give you this. I'll make you speak well. You'll be fine. I'll give you here's proof. You're wearing proof. No one's going to listen to you. I'll give you this staff. It'll turn into a snake. What else do you want, Moses? And then even after all these things, Moses says, no. It's mind-boggling, right? So the Jewish tradition has elevated this aspect of Moses as a sign of his humility, that leaders need to be humble and not be in such a rush to elevate themselves, to gain power. It's not about power for themselves. It's about being a leader. Means accepting a tremendous responsibility and taking that responsibility with utmost seriousness. But I think the story also tells us that we need to think widely about who can be a hero and who can be a leader, right? We have women leaders, we have men leaders. We have, in the Bible, we have not a lot of women leaders, but some very important ones. We have Moses with his stutter. Right? Heroes and leaders don't come in one particular mold. And I think this is a real important message for today when we are, accepting of and trying to embrace people where they are, and when we're looking for leaders, that we have to be accepting of some things which might be thought of flaws, but in some other ways can be strengths too. I think that's an important message.
No, I 100% agree with you. I'm curious in regards to the characters. We're going to exclude Moses from this part, but for the other characters that you had to do research on in order to find out their heroics, their flaws, was there anyone specifically that jumped out at you when doing your research that you, I guess, got a new respect for or appreciation, or just really kind of looked at it's like, in regards to them? And then I have one other question, but I'll let you answer this one first.
That's a great question, and I hope my true hope is that every reader will find something fresh and different in the way that I present these characters, because I certainly felt like I found something new and interesting in all of them. And the way I did that was by comparing the characters to heroes from other characters. For example, David, I compared to Julius Caesar, right? Yeah. And Julius Caesar was obviously a tremendous leader, militarily and politically. And then at a pivotal point in his career, he had this ambition. He had tremendous opposition from the Senate. Right. He had entrenched opponents who really were against him and were afraid that he was becoming too powerful, which he was, and didn't want him, after one of his glorious military victories, they didn't want him coming back because they feared he was so popular, he would take control. And then, Julius Caesar, he crosses the Rubicon and he thinks, you know what, maybe this is my time, not only to become Caesar, but to become emperor, to go beyond our democracy and be essentially a ruler for life. And he has one of his I think it's Anthony, or one of his circle stand in front of a crowd and presents him with the crown of an emperor to see how they would react. And they were like, oh, that's for God. The people are saying, don't do that. That's for God, not for you. And then he backs off. But it's his ambition suddenly comes through, and it presents kind of it shows who he is underneath, what he wants, and also presents kind of an obstacle to moving forward. And so that's the same with David. There's this really intricate, strange, fascinating undercurrent in the books of Samuel about David's ambition. On the one hand, he steps forward right away when Saul says, we have this Philistine enemy named Goliath who's threatening everyone, and our warriors can't approach him. He's just too strong. Our whole army couldn't put a dent in him. And David hears about it. He rushes up and says, ha, put me there. This Goliath is nothing, right? And sure enough, he kills him with the slingshot. Famous story. So clearly David has some ambition, right?
Right.
And then he's anointed in a secret ceremony by Samuel. He's made king, but he's not really king because Saul is still king officially. Anyway, there are story after story about David suppressing his ambition. He has the chance he meets Saul in a cave. He has a chance to kill him, and instead he cuts his cloak just to show him. And Saul is paranoid because he's afraid that David's going to take over, which he's right to be paranoid, to be honest. And David says, "Look, I just cut your cloak. I could have killed you. I had you cornered. And what did I do? You see, who am I? I don't want to replace you." Of course he does. And this happens over and over again. But he has to suppress his ambition in order for him to achieve his ambition, right? Because eventually he does become king. Eventually, Saul and his next in line, Jonathan, are killed. Eventually, a whole bunch of Saul's members of his house are killed. But in every case, David goes out of his way of expressing how sorry he is, how much this happened against his will. But there's this undercurrent that maybe he really wanted this all along. So it's a very interesting tension.
So
that it really, the comparison with Caesar really shines a light on. And there are many others like that. I compare, for example, Esther with Scheherazade. And they're both, go ahead, sorry.
No. I just, like I said, I want to make sure that we don't go over just because I want people to read the book. But the other question I was going to ask you because again, you cover a number of different characters. Is there any particular characters or any specific person in the Bible that wasn't in the book that you would have liked to have had in the book? And if so, what was the reason that you wanted them, but then it didn't work out? So, is anyone specific or who came to mind?
Right. That's a great question. I think your question really gets to the heart of the biblical hero, is that there's no firm line between who is a hero and who isn't in the Bible. And there are a lot of characters who have potential to be seen as heroes and for people to rightly take as their hero.
Right.
And what the characters I chose here, I chose them because I felt they're the most deeply drawn, and because they're the most deeply drawn, they're the most problematic, complicated. And that's really, that problematic, complicated aspect is what the Bible says heroes are, because at some level, really God is the only hero. That people can't be above the normal human estate, as it were. In terms of other characters, well, here's an interesting one. I thought, well, maybe the Bible's message is that the people of Israel are potentially the real hero. Of course, they're portrayed very problematically, stiff-necked. But we can take them as a whole. In some ways, they're portrayed as like one person. So that's, but that would have been a little bit far afield, a little complicated. There are other characters who I think are just beautiful, wonderful heroes, like Ruth, and very subtle, but not quite as kind of gray, not as much gray as the characters I've discussed here. So I looked around.
So let me ask, for anyone who's been watching this and is intrigued by your writing, intrigued by your book, what would you want the takeaway for whoever's watching this to be? Would it be to go buy the book? Would it be like what would you want someone at the end of this video to have gotten from this wonderful conversation?
I think my book aims to be a spur to help people think about who they hold as heroes and why, how they regard heroes. I think it's really important to have heroes at any age. I think heroes are essentially, as the Greeks said, especially important for youth, as they help kind of find models for whom they want to be. It's important for society to give our youth models for heroes, but it's at any age, I think, having heroes and reading about people. When we read a biography, usually it's because there's something fascinating and noteworthy about the person that we want to learn about and perhaps learn from as well. So I think, I want people to take away that we need to be, in some ways, a little more tolerant of our heroes than we sometimes are, because I think a lot of times people say, oh, this person's so great, and then the next second they do something bad or wrong, and then that's it, right? We throw them out. We often have a very cartoonish black and white vision of heroes, and the Bible says people aren't like that, and we can't have heroes like that. We need to live in the gray and the nuance often, but also look for what's noble and vital and admirable about people as well. And another thing is that the Bible's message is that a lot, if not almost anyone, has the potential to be a hero or to act heroically, to rise, to take the complicated dough of human nature and to raise it to something finer. And I think that studying the Bible can help us do that.
So for anyone who's curious about your writings or any of your future writings, where's the best place for people to find you in the future? Is there a particular website or an email or anything?
Yeah, thank you. So I decided to enter the 21st century. I created a website where I occasionally post blog thoughts extending the conversation about heroes in the Bible and other thoughts. And you can certainly find me there. If you Google me, you'll find me for sure. You can find me at Prisma. If anyone wants to get in touch with me personally, my book's widely available. And I'd be happy to come and talk to book groups or synagogues. Anybody who will have me wants to talk about biblical heroes, think about them, and have a good conversation. Happy to do so virtually or, God willing, one day soon in person.
Absolutely. So, Elliot, I really want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. I very much enjoyed the book. I hope other people who watch this will look into it, purchase this themselves. To everyone out there, I want to say I hope you stay safe, stay healthy. Hope to have you watch future videos. Elliot, it was wonderful to have you here today.
It was a pure delight. Thank you for having me. I'm really honored to speak to you and your audience.
Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.